Imagine waking up one morning and being told you were going to prison. Not because you did something wrong. Not because a judge found you guilty. Just because. No trial. No lawyer. No date set for your release. You were simply thrown inside and forgotten. Now imagine that prison has no real guards inside. No one to protect you. No one to stop what happens next. The men in charge are not wearing uniforms. They are wearing the same dirty clothes as everyone else. And they decide who eats, who sleeps, who lives. This is not a story someone made up. This is not a horror movie. Every single thing you are about to hear actually happened. In a real place. To real people. And for decades, the world looked the other way. If you think you know what a prison looks like, forget everything. Because where we are going is different. Where we are going, the rules of the outside world do not exist. And once you walk through those gates, the only law that matters is the one made by the men who already own the place. Stay with us, because what you are about to find out will change the way you see everything. If this is already giving you chills, hit that subscribe button right now, because we go places most channels are too afraid to touch. Venezuela, a country in South America with beautiful beaches, rich oil, and a complicated history. For many years, it was one of the wealthiest countries in the region. But underneath all of that, something was rotting quietly. Something that the government knew about. Something that human rights organizations begged the world to pay attention to. And something that the people trapped inside could never escape. In the city of Maracaibo, in the hot and humid state of Zulia, there stood a prison. It had a simple name, La Sabaneta, the Maracaibo National Prison. It opened in 1958, the same year Venezuela was supposed to be moving toward a better future. It was built with 4 sections, one for military officers and police, one for people with lighter crimes, one for general prisoners, and one for the most dangerous criminals of all. On paper, it was supposed to hold 700 people. 700. That number is important. Remember it, because by the time the world finally started paying attention, there were more than 3,700 people living inside those walls. More than 5 times what the prison was built for. People were sleeping in hallways, on floors, in places that were never meant to be lived in. Hundreds of men sharing bathrooms that were never cleaned, sharing water that was barely drinkable, sharing space that no human being should ever have to share. But here is the thing that makes La Sabaneta truly different from any other overcrowded prison in the world. It was not run by guards. It was not run by the government. It was run by the prisoners themselves. And that fact alone changes everything about this story. In most prisons around the world, guards carry the power. They have the keys. They have the weapons. They set the rules. If you break the rules, they punish you. That is how it works everywhere. Not in Venezuela. By the time La Sabaneta became known across the world, about 80% of Venezuelan prisons were being run from the inside. Not by officials, not by the justice system, by inmates, by the strongest, most feared men locked up inside. These men had a name. They were called Prans. 1 Pran per prison, 1 king per kingdom, and his word was the only word that mattered. Inside La Sabaneta, the Pran was not just a powerful man. He was everything. He decided who got a bed, who got food, who got protection, and who got nothing. If you came in with money, you could pay for a better spot. If you came in with nothing, you started at the bottom. And the bottom of La Sabaneta was a place no one wanted to be. Now here is something that might surprise you. Many of the people trapped inside La Sabaneta had never been found guilty of any crime. Not officially, not legally. Across Venezuela, around 75% of prisoners were pretrial detainees. That means they had been arrested, thrown in, and left there while waiting for a court date that might never come. Months, sometimes years, sitting in one of the most dangerous places on earth, waiting for a system that had forgotten they existed. Think about that. 3 out of every 4 people inside that prison might have been innocent, or at least they had never been given the chance to prove it. The guards? There were barely any. Reports from 2012 showed that at certain times, as few as 8 wardens were on duty inside the entire prison. 8 people responsible for more than 3,000 men. And those 8 were not even fully inside. They stayed near the edges, near the gates, because going deeper into the prison meant entering a world they did not control. A world that had its own rules, its own economy, its own justice. And yes, there was an economy inside La Sabaneta. If you wanted to sleep somewhere safe, you paid. If you wanted to eat something that would not make you sick, you paid. If you wanted protection from the men who roamed the darker sections of the prison at night, you paid. And if you could not pay, that was a problem. A serious one. The Pran and his closest men controlled everything that came in and went out. Drugs, weapons, food, phones, money. A whole underground market operating inside concrete walls, completely invisible to the government on the outside. And somehow, the government allowed it to continue. Year after year, decade after decade. But there is something even stranger. Something that investigators and journalists discovered when they dug deeper into La Sabaneta. Something that, when you hear it, might make you laugh at first, until you realize what it actually means. Inside the prison, some of the most powerful men had swimming pools. Not shared pools, not some cracked basin filled with dirty water. Private pools, built inside the prison walls, for the men who ran the place. While hundreds of inmates slept on concrete floors. While families on the outside had no idea if their loved ones were alive. While the justice system pretended to function. The men at the top of La Sabaneta's food chain were living in a way that most people on the outside could not even afford. That is not a metaphor. That is not exaggeration. It was reported and confirmed. The Pran section of the prison was a different world entirely. But how did it get this bad? How does a prison go from being a government-run facility to a place where the inmates build swimming pools and rule with complete power? The answer is simple, but it is also uncomfortable. Nobody cared enough to stop it. The government was underfunded. The justice system was overwhelmed. The guards were outnumbered and, in many cases, too afraid to act. And so, slowly, over years and years, the power shifted. It did not happen overnight. It happened the way all dangerous things happen. Quietly, gradually, until one day you wake up and realize the world has completely changed around you. By the time La Sabaneta became what it became, reversing it seemed almost impossible. The Prans had connections outside the prison. They had phones. They had people on the outside working for them. They had more weapons inside those walls than some small armies. And they had one thing that was perhaps more powerful than all of that combined. They had information. They knew who was who. They knew who had money on the outside. They knew which guards could be paid to look the other way. They knew how to keep people scared. And a scared person is a controllable person. For decades, the world outside the walls of La Sabaneta knew very little about what was happening inside. Journalists were not allowed in easily. Families of inmates told horror stories. But horror stories are easy to ignore when they are coming from people society has already decided not to care about. And so the walls stayed up. The silence stayed thick. And inside, the suffering continued. But then something happened. Something that could not be ignored. Something so terrible, so massive, so shocking that it finally, forced the world to look. Drop a comment below and tell us. Did you know prisons like this actually existed? Because most people have no idea. And that is exactly the problem. We are not going to tell you what that something was. Not yet. Because you need to understand where these people were first. You need to feel the weight of what life was like inside La Sabaneta before we show you the moment that changed everything. What we can tell you is this. It happened on a specific day. It involved fire. And by the time it was over, the number of people who died made headlines around the world. But the number of people who died is not even the most disturbing part of that story. The most disturbing part is what the guards did, or more accurately, what they did not do, while it was happening. We are going to get there. We promise. Every answer is coming. But right now, we need you to sit with what you have learned so far. We need you to think about those 3,700 people crammed into a space built for 700. We need you to think about the ones who had never been convicted, the ones who were just waiting. And we need you to think about this one final thing before we move forward. Among those thousands of people inside La Sabaneta, there were children. Not visiting, not passing through, living there. An estimated 192 children were living inside that prison. Children of inmates, with nowhere else to go. Growing up inside those walls. Seeing everything. Knowing no other world. Let that sit with you for a moment. Because the next part of this story is where everything gets darker. There is a sound that people who lived near La Sabaneta knew very well. They heard it so often that after a while, it stopped making them flinch. It stopped making them run inside. It stopped making them call anyone for help. Because calling for help meant waiting. And waiting meant the sound would be over long before anyone arrived. The sound was gunfire. Not outside the prison. Inside it. Coming through the walls, over the fences, into the streets and neighborhoods that sat just beyond the prison gates. Families lived in those neighborhoods. Children played in those streets. And every so often, A bullet that started inside La Sabaneta would end its journey somewhere it was never supposed to go. A wall, a window, a person. This was not a rare event. This was Tuesday. This was Thursday afternoon. This was just life in the shadow of La Sabaneta. And the government? The authorities? They knew. Everyone knew. The prison was not a secret. It was not hidden in the jungle or buried underground. It sat in the middle of a city. A real, living, breathing city where real people went to work, raised families, and tried to build normal lives while something deeply abnormal festered right next to them. But knowing something is happening and choosing to act on it are two very different things. And for a very long time, the choice was to do nothing. Let's go deeper inside. If you have ever seen a crowded market, you have a small idea of what walking through certain parts of La Sabaneta might have felt like. Noise everywhere. People moving in every direction. Transactions happening. Arguments breaking out and dying down. Except instead of fruit stalls and clothing shops, what was being sold in this market was far more dangerous. Weapons were everywhere inside La Sabaneta, and not the kind of weapons you might expect prisoners to secretly hide under mattresses. We are not talking about sharpened pieces of metal or broken glass. Government raids on the prison turned up guns. Real guns. Military-grade weapons in some cases. Ammunition stockpiles. And alongside the weapons, drugs. Moving through the prison the way water moves through pipes. Constantly. In large amounts. How does a prison full of people with no freedom end up with that kind of firepower? That is the question that should have been asked loudly, repeatedly, and urgently. Because the answer pointed to something uncomfortable. The weapons had to come from somewhere. Someone on the outside was supplying them. And someone on the inside was making sure they stayed hidden well enough that the occasional government raid never truly emptied the supply. During one raid, guards and soldiers recovered an almost unbelievable collection of items. Guns, drugs, and then something nobody expected. Animals, live animals, hidden inside the prison walls. Not stray dogs or cats that had wandered in. The Pran and his inner circle had collected exotic animals. Jungle animals, some of them endangered species, kept as pets, as symbols of power, as proof that inside La Sabaneta, if you were at the top, you could have anything you wanted. A man locked in a prison, owning endangered animals, having a private pool built, running a drug and weapons operation that the government could not fully shut down, receiving visitors, making phone calls, conducting business. This is not a story about a prisoner. This is a story about a man who happened to be living inside walls. His name was Edwin, known to everyone inside and outside those walls by one name, Macho Edwin. Macho in Spanish is a word used for someone missing a limb. Edwin had lost part of his arm, but what he lacked in one arm, he more than made up for in power, intelligence, and ruthlessness. Edwin first entered the prison system in 2006. He was released in 2007. A short stay, but it was enough. Because when he came back, sent back for committing triple homicide, he came back with knowledge. Knowledge of how the system worked. Knowledge of the people inside. Knowledge of what it took to climb to the top of a world where climbing to the top was the only way to survive. And climb he did. By the time the outside world started paying serious attention to La Sabaneta, Macho Edwin was not just a powerful inmate. He was the Pran, the king, the man whose name everyone inside knew. The man the guards on the outside avoided confronting directly. The man who had turned a section of the prison into something that looked, in some ways, more comfortable than the neighborhoods surrounding it. He had people, a network, men inside who enforced his rules, men outside who moved his products, delivered his messages, and kept his operation running like a business. Because that is what it was, a business, built inside a prison, funded by fear, and protected by a system too broken to dismantle it. But even kings have enemies. Even the most powerful man in a prison full of dangerous men has to sleep, has to watch his back, has to make sure the people around him are loyal enough not to betray him. Inside La Sabaneta, loyalty was the most valuable currency of all. More valuable than money. More valuable than weapons. Because money could be taken. Weapons could be seized. But a loyal man standing next to you when things went wrong, that was something no raid could remove. And things went wrong. Often. Violently. Suddenly. Gang rivalries inside La Sabaneta were not like arguments that ended with harsh words and cold shoulders. They ended with bodies. With blood on concrete floors. With men dragged from their sleeping spots in the night. With scores being settled in ways that left no room for appeal. In 2013 alone, 69 prisoners were killed inside La Sabaneta. That is more than one person every 5 days. Dying in a place where they were supposed to be held safely. Dying while the courts had not even decided their fate yet. Dying in a place that, by every legal definition, was under government supervision. 8 guards. Remember that number from before. At certain times, only 8 wardens were inside for more than 3,000 men. 8 people trying to manage a world that had long since stopped being manageable. The Venezuelan National Guard patrolled the perimeter, the outside fence. But inside was a different country, and nobody with a uniform wanted to be the one to walk too far in. This created something that experts call a vacuum of authority. When official power disappears, unofficial power fills the empty space. And unofficial power does not come with courts or lawyers or the right to a fair hearing. Unofficial power comes with whatever the man holding it decides it comes with. For the people at the bottom of La Sabaneta, the ones with no money, no connections, no protection, life was a daily negotiation with fear. Every morning was a calculation. Who do I avoid today? What do I owe and to who? How do I make it to tonight without becoming a problem for someone who has the power to make me disappear? If this story is hitting different for you, smash that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. We are just getting to the part that changes everything. Now, let's talk about the children again. 192 children, living inside La Sabaneta, not visiting on weekends, not staying for a few hours during approved family time, living there, full-time, growing up inside those walls. These were the children of inmates, mostly of women who had been imprisoned and had no one on the outside to care for their children. So the children stayed, because a prison, as horrifying as it sounds, was still better than leaving a small child alone in the world with nothing and no one. Think about what those children saw every day. Think about what they heard. Think about what they learned about how the world works before they were even old enough to go to school. For them, the Pran was the natural order of things. Weapons were normal. Fear was the language everyone spoke. The outside world, the world with classrooms and playgrounds and birthday parties, was the strange and foreign place. La Sabaneta was home. What do you become when that is your childhood? That question does not have a comfortable answer. But of everything that happened inside La Sabaneta across its 55 years of operation, one event stands above all others. One night that burned itself into the history of the prison. One moment when the silence that the world had kept around La Sabaneta was finally, violently, impossibly broken. It happened in January. The year was 1994, and it started, like so many catastrophic things do, with something small. A decision made by a group of men who wanted to send a message to another group of men. The message was fire. What happened after that fire was started is one of the most disturbing things ever recorded in the history of any prison anywhere in the world. Not just because of how many people died, but because of the choices that were made by the people who were supposed to stop it. We know what they chose. We know what they did. And we know how long they waited before they did anything at all. For hours. That number will mean something very soon. Hold on to it, because in the next part of this story, we are going inside the night of January 3rd, 1994. We are going to walk through exactly what happened, minute by minute, decision by decision. We're going to look at the people who started it, the people who survived it, and the people in uniform who stood outside while it happened. And then we are going to ask the question that nobody, not the government, not the courts, not a single official, ever truly answered. Why did no one come? Drop a comment right now. What do you think the guards were doing for those 4 hours while people were dying inside? Because what actually happened is going to shock you. The fire was not an accident. Let's be clear about that. It was a weapon, used on purpose, by people who knew exactly what they were doing, in a space so crowded that escape was nearly impossible for hundreds of men who had nothing to do with the fight that started it. What happened next, what the survivors described, what the investigators found, what the reports tried to put into words, was something that the human mind struggles to fully hold. And it all comes down to this. The men who started the fire did not just start a fire and walk away. They stayed. They waited. And when the other men, the ones trapped in the smoke and the heat, tried to run, tried to push through the gates, tried to climb over each other to reach open air, the ones who started the fire were there, with weapons, waiting for them. The fire was not meant to burn the building. The fire was meant to drive the men out. And the men with weapons were meant to finish what the fire started. What happened that night in La Sabaneta was not a riot. It was not chaos. It was something far more calculated than that. And the full truth of it, the numbers, the names, the decisions that were made, and the decisions that were not. That is exactly where we are going next. January 3rd, 1994. Maracaibo, Venezuela. Inside La Sabaneta. It is nighttime. The prison is loud the way it always is at night. Voices bouncing off concrete walls, the distant sounds of arguments, the low hum of thousands of men packed into a space built for a fraction of their number. Nobody sleeps easily in La Sabaneta. You keep one eye open. You stay aware. Because the night is when things happen. But this night is different. In one section of the prison, a group of men have made a decision. A decision that has been building for a while, fed by the slow pressure of gang rivalry, of debts unpaid, of territory disputed, of pride wounded in a place where pride is sometimes the only thing a man has left. They have thought about this. They have planned it. And now, in the dark and the noise and the heat of a Venezuelan January night, they are ready. They start a fire. Not a small fire. Not an accidental spark. A deliberate, spreading, hungry fire inside a building packed with people who have almost nowhere to go. The smoke moves fast. Faster than most people expect smoke to move. It fills corridors. It creeps under the doors of the sections that were supposed to be locked. It finds the men who are sleeping, who are resting, who have no idea what is coming until they open their eyes, and the air is already thick and dark. Men start moving, shouting, pushing. The sections of the prison that were already too small for the number of people inside them become something close to impossible to move through. Men are falling. Men are climbing over each other. Men are screaming toward the gates, toward any opening, toward any piece of air that does not burn on the way down. And the men who started the fire? They are ready for this too. Because this was never just about the fire. The fire was the trap. The weapons were the purpose. As the men poured out of the burning sections, coughing, choking, desperate for air, the group that had started everything was waiting. Armed, positioned, ready. The ones who escaped the fire ran directly into something worse. There was no clean exit. There was no safe direction to run. The fire was behind them. The weapons were in front of them. And the guards? Outside, at the perimeter, on the other side of the gates. Reports from survivors and investigations that followed described a chilling picture. The guards, the people whose entire job was to maintain order and protect the lives of the people inside, did not enter. For a long time, an extraordinarily, inexcusably long time, they did not go in. They stood at the edges. They listened to what was happening. And they waited. For hours. That is the number that has followed this story ever since. For hours before any serious response came from the outside. For hours during which the fire burned, the weapons were used, and men, many of them men who had not even been convicted of a crime yet, died. The exact number of people who died that night is something that different sources have argued about. The official numbers and the unofficial numbers do not match. Some sources put the death toll at around 106. Others say the real number was higher. Some witnesses and investigators suggested the count climbed past 150 when you included the people who were killed not by fire, but by the men with weapons who were waiting at the exits. What is not disputed is this. It was one of the single deadliest prison events ever recorded anywhere in the world. In one night, in one building, in a city where people on the outside could hear it happening. And not a single official was ever convicted for what happened. Not one person in a position of authority ever faced legal consequences for the choices made that night, or the years of neglect that made that night possible. If that does not make your blood boil, let's keep going. Because what came after is just as disturbing as the night itself. In the days following January 3rd, 1994, the world reacted. Human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International published reports. Journalists wrote about it. Politicians in Venezuela were asked uncomfortable questions. For a brief moment, the spotlight fell on La Sabaneta and on the Venezuelan prison system and on the thousands of human beings locked inside conditions that no court, no law, no standard of basic decency could justify. And then, slowly, the spotlight moved. The world found other things to pay attention to. The reports got filed. The questions stopped being asked. The families of the people who died were left with grief and no justice. And La Sabaneta kept running. The overcrowding did not improve. The Pran system did not collapse. The weapons kept coming in. The guards stayed at the perimeter. The children kept growing up inside those walls. The 1994 massacre did not change La Sabaneta. It just proved, in the most brutal way possible, what La Sabaneta already was. And the years that followed proved something else. That it could keep going. That a system this broken, this violent, this deeply unjust could continue operating for decades more without being truly fixed. Because fixing it would have required something that was never fully present: political will, money, accountability, and a genuine belief that the people inside those walls deserved to be treated as human beings. Instead, what came was more of the same. More overcrowding, more deaths, smaller riots that never made international headlines because they were not large enough to be impossible to ignore. 69 people killed in 2013 alone. Year after year, a slow and steady drumbeat of violence that everyone pretended was simply the natural order of things. It was not the natural order of things. It was the result of choices. Choices made by people with power who chose to spend that power somewhere else. Comment below. Do you think the people responsible for La Sabaneta should have faced justice? Because the answer to what actually happened to them is something most people find hard to believe. By 2013, something had finally shifted. Not because the government had suddenly grown a conscience, and not because the international community had applied enough pressure to force real change. It shifted because La Sabaneta had become impossible to manage even on its own broken terms. A riot in September of that year killed 16 people. It was not the largest riot the prison had ever seen. It was not even close to the scale of 1994, but it became the final breaking point. The government announced that La Sabaneta would be closed. After 55 years of operation, after thousands of deaths, after decades of being known as one of the most violent and dangerous places on Earth, the Maracaibo National Prison was shutting down. The process of emptying it was not simple. More than 4,000 people had to be moved. Some were transferred to other facilities. Some were released. And through all of it, Macho Edwin, the Pran, the king of La Sabaneta, refused to go quietly. Reports from the time describe Edwin resisting the closure, fighting it, because La Sabaneta was not just a prison to him. It was his kingdom. He had built something inside those walls. He had power, protection, comfort, things that most people locked in a prison never come close to having. And now the government was asking him to leave that behind and become just another inmate somewhere else. He had been sent back to La Sabaneta after his release in 2007 for committing triple homicide. He had survived every raid, every riot, every shift in the political winds. He had made himself untouchable inside a world most people could barely imagine. And walking away from that, even by force, was something he was not willing to do without a fight. What happened to Edwin after the closure is a thread that disappears into the complicated tangle of Venezuela's justice system. A system so overloaded, so riddled with delay and dysfunction, that tracking one man through it is genuinely difficult. What we know is that he was inside. What happened after is a story that does not have a clean ending, because La Sabaneta's story does not have a clean ending either. The plan, after closure, was almost poetic in its irony. The government announced that La Sabaneta would be converted into a museum, that the site of so much suffering, so much violence, so many unmarked and uncounted deaths would become a place where ordinary citizens could walk through the halls, see the cells, stand in the spaces where history happened, and learn about what the Venezuelan prison system had produced. Whether that museum was ever fully built is unclear. What is clear is that in August 2023, 10 years after the prison officially closed, the Venezuelan Prison Observatory, an organization that monitors prison conditions in the country, issued a warning. Local residents near Maracaibo were reporting something that made their stomachs drop. La Sabaneta sounded like it was active again. People were being seen near the facility. Noises were coming from inside. The Venezuelan Prison Observatory reported that locals feared the prison had quietly been reopened. Think about what that means. A place that was closed because it had become too violent, too overcrowded, too broken to justify keeping open, potentially reopened without announcement, without reform, without any of the changes that would have needed to happen to make it anything other than what it always was. No official confirmation was given. No clear answer from the government. Just silence. The same silence that had surrounded La Sabaneta for most of its existence. The silence of a system that hoped if it said nothing, people would stop asking questions. But here's what this whole story is really about. Underneath the violence, underneath the prans and the weapons and the fire of 1994, underneath the swimming pools and the endangered animals and the 8 guards for 3,000 men. Underneath all of it is something simpler and more devastating. People were forgotten. Thousands of people, many of them never convicted of anything, were placed inside a broken system and left there. Left to survive however they could. Left to navigate a world built on fear and force because no one in power cared enough to build anything better. The Pran system did not grow in La Sabaneta because men are naturally violent or naturally cruel. It grew because when you remove every other structure, when you strip away every form of legitimate authority and replace it with nothing, people build their own structure. And the structure they build reflects the conditions they are surviving in. Violence becomes currency when there is nothing else. Power becomes everything when powerlessness means death. The men who ran La Sabaneta were not born monsters. They were shaped by a system that rewarded the most ruthless and punished the most vulnerable, and then left everyone inside to figure it out alone. That does not excuse what happened. The violence, the exploitation, the terror that the most powerful men inside La Sabaneta inflicted on the most vulnerable, none of that is defensible. But understanding where it came from matters. Because if we do not understand where it came from, we cannot stop it from happening somewhere else. And it is happening somewhere else. Right now. In prisons around the world where overcrowding is ignored, where guards are outnumbered and underpaid, where the justice system moves so slowly that people spend years inside before their cases are ever heard. La Sabaneta was extreme. But the ingredients that made it were not unique to Venezuela. The ingredients are available everywhere. And in places where no one is paying attention, those ingredients are already mixing. The children who grew up inside La Sabaneta are adults now. They are out in the world somewhere, carrying everything they saw, everything they learned, everything that was normal to them inside those walls. What did they do with that? What did the world offer them when they finally walked out? Those questions do not have easy answers. They might not have answers at all. The families of the people who died in January 1994 are still waiting for justice that has never come and may never come. The guards who stood outside for 4 hours were never held accountable. The officials who oversaw a prison that was 5 times over capacity for years were never held accountable. The system that produced La Sabaneta and thousands of places like it continues to operate, continues to take people in, continues to produce the same results. And somewhere in Maracaibo, the building still stands. Quiet now, or at least quieter than it once was. The walls are still there. The cells are still there. The history is still there, soaked into every surface, waiting in every shadow. 55 years, thousands of lives, countless deaths, one building, and a world that, for most of that time, chose not to look. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you angry in the way that important things should make you angry, share this video with someone. Not because we asked you to, because stories like this only matter if people hear them. The people inside La Sabaneta had no voice. The least we can do is make sure their story travels further than those walls ever let them go. Subscribe if you are not already part of this community. We tell the stories that most people walk past. The ones that are uncomfortable. The ones that are true. The ones that deserve to be heard. And leave a comment below. Tell us what hit you the hardest in this story. Because every comment is a reminder that these were real people, real lives, and real choices made by real systems that we all, in some way, have a responsibility to understand. The walls of La Sabaneta may be quiet now, but the story is not over.